Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Michelle Anderson. I spent 2 decades working in equine media, and I currently create content and help veterinarians and businesses connect with horse owners through my consulting business, Cadence Marketing and Media. I'm a trail rider, dressage rider, and an at-home horse keeper.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Clair Thunes of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and a pony club mom.
Claire and I collaborated for years when I was the editor of an equine publication, and she was one of our regular contributors. We'd finish work, but we always had more to talk about. New products, new research, and our own horses. This podcast is an extension of those conversations. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding and caring for their own horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode. For part 2 of our Equine Nutrition Basics series, we're going to be discussing bagged feeds. Horse people tend to call anything that comes in a 50-pound bag grain, and I put air quotes around that listeners can't see, but that isn't necessarily an accurate description of what's in those bags.
That's so true. I can't tell you how many times I've done a consultation and we get to discussing what the horse gets as far as grain, and I'm told they're getting alfalfa pellets as their grain. And then I have to kind of explain that that's not a grain, that's a forage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we use, grain as the verb, Are you going to go grain the horses? And it just means, are you going to go give them their ration that isn't their hay? So it can be really...
Scoop. Yeah, anything you scoop and put in a bucket ends up being grain.
Yeah. And it can be really confusing, especially for newer horse owners who don't realize that. And especially if you have this Mr. Ed concept of horses eat oats, and so they think they're getting, a coffee can full of oats. That's not necessarily what's in those bags, although you can buy bags of oats. So can you, Claire, explain to us what is the difference between grain, actual grain, hay pellets, a ration balancer, which is another bagged feed that people will see, concentrates, performance feeds, or specific need feeds like senior feeds or growth feeds, and then also complete feeds, and then supplements. And we're definitely going to talk about supplements in a future episode because that is a big rabbit hole we can go down on the supplement trail.
Sure. For sure. Well, I can just tell you, I'm overwhelmed sitting here listening to you tell me all these different things of feed.
Yeah. Imagine being a new horse owner, and you go to the feed store and you stare at the shelves and go, okay, what do I feed my horse?
I'm not sure I've ever had anybody list out all the categories like that before.
Mm-hmm.
It is overwhelming. I'm sitting, I can feel them all coming at me.
Mm-hmm. I have spreadsheets with all their price points and. So, and I'm sure you probably do too.
Well, that's true.
But it's your job.
Yeah, exactly. I do it out of a different necessity.
Yeah.
But anyway, yes, there are many different kind of categories of grain in inverted commas or bagged feeds as we're referring them today. And yes, let's start off with, as we said earlier, they're not all grain. So you have your hay pellets and cubes come in a bag. Beet pulp comes in a bag. Those are not grains. They would all fall under the forage category. So we're going to kind of put those out of the way a little bit. We just did a whole episode on kind of forages, and we explained there about differences and some basic differences in forages. So we'll just kind of leave those off to the side for now. But all of the other categories we have, let's start with concentrates, right? So concentrate feeds provide something in a greater concentration than would be typical in the horse's diet. So we talked about in that forage episode about how forage should be the foundation of the horse's diet. So most forages, like most grass hays, run, 0.8, 1 megacalorie per pound. Alfalfa maybe 1.1 megacalorie per pound. So some feeds, bagged feeds, are going to be energy concentrates and are going to provide a more concentrated form of energy per pound than those forages would. So maybe their calorie content's going to be 1.3, 1.5 megacalories per day. Some of the really high, like 12% fat feeds, their calories going to be almost closer to like 2 megacalories per day, right? So those would be energy concentrates. Then you have concentrates where the concentrated nutrient is, for example, protein. So ration balances kind of fall under that because ration balances, most hays kind of have most grass hays, good quality grass hay, maybe 10, 12% protein. A sensible alfalfa for a horse might be like 18, 20% protein, whereas our ration balances, most of those are in like the 30% protein. So you can see that's more concentrated percentage of protein. So they are protein concentrates. They are also vitamin and mineral concentrates because they're heavily, heavily fortified because their serving size is so small that they are going to give the horse all the vitamins and minerals he needs that were not being provided in the forage in our super small serving size of like 1 or 2 pounds per day. Whereas that energy concentrate, that performance feed that's saying, okay, this horse is working hard. It needs quite a lot of extra calories in addition to what it gets from its hay. So we're expecting the feeding rate to be like 6-9 pounds per day. The same vitamin and mineral level that was in your 1-2 pound ration balancer is now going to be spread out over that 6-9 pounds of performance feed. So the vitamin mineral profile of the performance feeds is more dilute, if that makes sense, than it will be in a ration balancer because of the serving size difference. Then you have, say, our complete feeds, and these are really misunderstood. I got a lot of people who say, well, I feed, Purina Senior, and I feed a couple of pounds a day. And you say, okay, well, why do you feed that? Well, it's a complete feed, so it's going to give him everything he needs. And it's like, well, yes, if you fed that as the only thing that horse ate.
So, and to the minimum recommendation for serving size.
Absolutely. So the complete feeds have enough fiber in them that you don't have to feed that horse any forage. You don't have to feed any hay, any pasture. They're getting that all in that bag of feed. That the hay, forage, fiber component that they need is in that bag as well. And so that original Purina Senior, like for an average, I think 1,200 pound horse, has a serving size, I want to say it's around 17 pounds per day. It's a lot. And, so I have clients go, good golly, I couldn't possibly feed my horse that much. Like, he'd go ballistic or he'd be obese or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but you wouldn't be feeding any hay with it. And so most people misfeed that feed. So that's what a complete feed it is. It is a complete diet put in a bag. Feed and then feed your horse. Now, senior feeds, and I kind of use that particular senior feed as example. Not all senior feeds have to be fed as complete feeds. Many of them are complete feeds, but they don't have to be fed as complete feeds. So that, for example, like Triple Crown Senior can be a complete feed, but it doesn't have to be a complete feed. It can also be fed at like 6 pounds a day with hay. So 6 pounds being the minimum serving size on that particular feed. But if you're feeding it at 6 pounds per day, the assumption is you're feeding that horse that 1.5 to 2% of body weight as forage per day for the rest of their fiber that they need and the rest of the nutrition that they need. Now, because people were kind of like not feeding the original Purina Senior correctly, like they now have their like healthy active or the active senior, which when you look at the feeding instructions on that feed is much more like the sort of 6 to 8 pound. It's not a complete, it's not designed to be, actually, I don't know if it can be fed as a complete feed. I haven't looked at it for a while, but certainly it can be fed at that smaller serving size rate. It's more heavily fortified for that smaller serving size. So those are the senior feeds. Senior feeds may or may not be a complete feed. Just to confuse it even more, it's not just senior feeds that are complete feeds. So, for example, Purina have their junior feed, which is for young horses. That's a complete feed. right? Again, you don't need to feed any hay with that. It's a complete feed, but specifically the nutrition profile in that is for young growing horses. Most growth feeds are not complete feeds. Most growth feeds are, they have a serving size to supplement the forage and the hay that young horse is getting. And then as far as the vitamin mineral profile of all these different feeds, again, that's going to depend on the demands that an average senior horse, young growing horse, performance horse might be having made upon it and the needs that it might have. So the mineral differences between, requirements between a 1,200 pound senior horse and a 1,200 pound horse that's working aren't going to be vastly different. What you'll notice, though, is that the senior feed might have a little bit more protein. They tend to be around 14% protein because we know that senior horses don't always utilize protein as well. The ingredients, kind of the first few ingredients in that list of ingredients on the tag might be like more digestible. Because we sometimes know that some senior horses don't utilize their feed quite as well as younger horses, that digestive tracts aren't functioning quite as well as they used to. So you'll expect to see sort of more easily digestible, fermentable, like a lot of beet pulp, that kind of thing at the front end of that feed tag in a senior feed. Similarly, in a growth feed, the amino acid profile that's being guaranteed might be a little different to kind of more accurately reflect the amino acids that are needed to support good quality growth versus what you might find in just a mature adult horse's feed that's, formulated for them. So that's where you start getting into the nuances between the different feeds. So
it's not as simple as just going to the feed store, looking at the wall and picking the one that the bag or label matches your horse. I have a young horse, I have an old horse, senior growth performance, or even just going in and buying the cheapest bag. Let's just do the budget option. And the prices vary so much. It's all probably a 50-pound bag, maybe a 40-pound bag. Just depending.
Paying attention to. Paying attention to. Some of them are even less. And I know, especially if you shop on Chewy, some of them are like 25-pound bags. They're quite small. Because it helps keep the shipping costs down. So it's really worth doing the math per pound. Don't do cost per bag, break it out and do cost per pound, and you might be surprised.
Yeah. So if you're staring down a bag of a ration balancer that's $45 a bag, and the other option is a senior feed from the same company that is maybe $39 a bag, which one's a better value?
Yeah, well, I see. That's the thing. Are you going to feed it properly or not? That's the $1 million question, right? Because this is what I run into. I'll run into people that are feeding, a senior. Senior feeds are so popular, right? Everybody loves a senior feed, right? So that's quite often I'll run into people feeding some senior feed or other, and I just feed 1 or 2 pounds per day. It's sometimes I get that it's just a treat after he rides, and I'm like, well, if he's getting it 6 days a week, it's not really a treat, it's part of his actual diet. And when you look at the feeding directions, like I said, and it's like a minimum of 6 pounds, maybe even like 17 pounds depending on the specific one you've chosen, and we and then I'll say, well, if really all you're doing is feeding it 1 or 2 pounds, you're not feeding the feeding directions. You're not going to get all the nutritional benefit that's been put into that feed because it's designed to be fed at a specific rate. Yeah. And if you don't feed it at the feeding directions, you're not going to get all of the benefits, and your horse's diet may have deficiencies as a result of that. So if you just need to feed 1 or 2 pounds to your horse in addition to their hay, you'd be better off feeding a ration balancer that's designed to be fed at 1 or 2 pounds per day. But then you're going to get that sticker shock because you're going to go and you're going to say, well, I was buying a bag that was like $39 a bag and feeding 1 or 2 pounds a day. And now she's got me going to the feed store and buying this ration balancer and feeding 1 or 2 pounds per day. And it's $45 a bag. It's my feeding costs have gone up. And you're not wrong. Your feeding costs have gone up, but you're getting so much more bang for your buck because your horse is now getting the proper nutrition, the proper levels of things like copper and zinc and vitamin E. And the long-term ramifications of having a diet that's deficient in those things, it will potentially cost you money down the line. So just to kind of make a point with that, for example, copper is needed for collagen formation. So collagen is the foundation of all your bone, your tendons, your ligaments. So if your horse is on a diet that has a suboptimal level of copper for 5 or 6 years, is it possible that that starts to result in their soft tissues not being as resilient as they should be? Possibly. Right? I mean, I think we know in human nutrition that, I can get away, in inverted commas, with eating a not a very good diet when I'm in my 20s and 30s. And then when I'm in my 50s and 60s, it's like, well, shoot, that just caught up with me. And now I'm diabetic, or I have, health issues that actually come from how I chose to eat in my 20s and 30s. And same is true a little bit with our horses. So it really does matter that you pick the right feed.
Yeah, and I'll add, because I trim my own horses that are barefoot, and a place where trying to save on feed or not giving them what they need, where it shows up is in their hoof quality, and you can cause a lot of other problems that maybe people don't directly connect with what the horse is eating with the problems they're having in the feed. But if you have a balanced diet, you're going to have a much better hoof quality. You're going to have probably less thrush in your horse's feet. You're going to have better growth, and you can just avoid some other problems. But I know we will.
Sure.
Yeah, I know we'll talk about feet and hoof supplements and nutrition for feet a lot in the future. I know we'll want to talk about it, but I just wanted to point that out, because you can spend a lot of money on vet care and farrier care that starts with not feeding for the feet. So, and
that's a great example, because I run into that a lot. I'll run into people that are feeding, a couple of pounds of senior, and they're using, their farrier's formula supplement and all these other hoof supplements and the like. And then I get rid of the senior feed, and I recommend, a couple of pounds of balancer, and I get rid of the farrier's formula or whatever hoof supplement they're using, and they freak out. And I'm like, no, you're now getting more copper and zinc in the diet. You're getting more of the nutrients that support hoof health, feeding this balancer correctly, than you were with your incorrectly fed senior feed and your hoof supplement. And, and like to your point, maybe they were dealing with thrush, maybe they had poor sole depth and were having to put pads on the horse because there wasn't enough sole thickness. Like, we don't think about it, but these choices show up and cost us money. I mean, a set of pads on a horse, how much that is per shoeing, it's not cheap. It starts to add up. So you have to really think about that, where your money's going.
Yeah. And you have to be patient, because it's not an overnight fix either.
That too.
Yeah. So you have mentioned feeding by 6 pounds or 2 pounds or 1 pound. Why aren't you saying feed by a coffee can full?
Well,
or a scoop?
First of all, because I'm English and I don't drink coffee.
Oh,
I wouldn't have a coffee can to use. But no,
I know that's not true.
Well, there's somebody else in my house that drinks coffee.
Yes, yeah.
So, no, scoops and everything are great, but whose scoop? My scoop? Your scoop? What kind of scoop? Different people use different things, and I was just recently actually doing in a barn with somebody, and they feed a lot of horses, and they had a wheelie trash bin. Really clever way of storing feed, actually, like putting the feed in one of those wheelie trash bins. And we opened the lid up, and I said, well, how much are you feeding? And they said, oh, they get 2 scoops. No, 1 scoop. Sorry, 1 scoop. And I looked in the bin, and in there was a 1 cup scoop. And I said, this 1 cup scoop? And he said, yes, they all get that 1 cup scoop of balancer. And I thought, oh, brother, like, your balancer's not doing anything for you, because it's the equivalent of feeding 2 pounds of a 17-pound serving size senior feed. But anyway, so what scoop, right? Like, what scoop are you using? And everybody's sense of, even with those box scoops or 3-quart scoops, like, are you filling it to the point where it's overflowing, or are you filling it to the little ledge by the handle? Are you filling it so it's flush with the top? Like, different people, if you've got different people feeding. So yes, I don't, advocate feeding by scoops. I advocate feeding by weight. But let's be honest, like, I'm using a scoop every time I feed my horse, right? So and I don't weigh my feed every time I feed, but what I do is I weigh the amount I want one time into my scoop, but I have a Sharpie marker pen and I draw a line on my scoop, but I say, this is 1 pound of whatever it is I'm feeding. And then the next time I come out, I just have to fill it to that line, and I know that it's a pound.
Yeah. Finally, I want to talk about storing feed, because rodents like to get into it, horses like to get into it. It's a huge risk to have horses get into feed. If you have an escape artist horse and feed isn't locked up in a place where they can't get to it and they eat it, that is an emergency when they gorge, and can lead to laminitis. And can you, Claire, explain a little bit about why that happens?
Yes, and I have a personal story on this. Like my favorite chestnut pony, got into our feed room, and there was actually a bag of chicken feed in there. Even worse, potentially. And it was a brand new bag of feed. I knew it was a brand new bag of feed because I had moved it, 2 days before, and there was basically nothing left when we found it. And he'd eaten pretty much the whole thing. So he ended up getting his stomach pumped and being put on activated charcoal, and then spending the next 7 days being stood in ice water for, twice a day for 30 minutes. So, which is a huge rigmarole. The reason why getting into grain room and eating, really any feed is a risk, because if they get into something that they're not used to feeding, it doesn't really matter what it is, it can cause a disruption in the digestive tract, because all of the enzymes and bacteria in the digestive tract, it may be an unfamiliar feed to them. And so they may not be able to process it very well, because the enzymes and bacteria in the horse's digestive tract are specific to what you're feeding, and they adjust slowly to the different nutrient compositions of the things that are coming into the diet. So when you make a sudden, let's just eat a 50-pound bag of chicken feed type diet adjustment, you don't have time for all those enzymes and bacteria to adjust to this thing that's very different from what the horse has been eating. And it can cause a lot of disruption. You can get, microbial die-off in the, it shifts the fermentation profile in the hindgut. And so you'll get maybe, you might get rapid fermentation of the starch components, which can result in gas. So you can end up with gas colic. The bacteria, as that starts to happen, bacteria start to die off and release toxins, and those toxins can end up in the bloodstream, and you can end up with a toxic-related laminitis. The other thing is obviously, that was obviously a concern for us with our pony. The other concern was he's a pony, and while he's not insulin resistant, if you do have a horse that is insulin dysregulated or has equine metabolic syndrome, getting into the feed room and eating feeds that are potentially too high in non-structural carbohydrates can really cause an insulin spike, as that easily digestible starch and sugar ends up in the bloodstream, and you'll spike insulin. And we know that spiking insulin can cause laminitis. So in those particularly sensitive individuals, you can get laminitis that way too. But the sheer load of feed consumed, you could overwhelm the small intestine, right? So the small intestine, again, these are designed to be trickle eaters. These horses should be consuming small amounts for 16 hours per day. So if you suddenly eat, I'm sure he ate the 50-pound bag of chicken feed pretty damn quickly. So I'm sure he thought somebody was coming to get him. Mm-hmm. It's not like he had all day to do it. So he consumed it pretty quickly. And, he will have overwhelmed his small intestinal capacity to digest the starch in that feed, and it will have ended up in the hindgut. And you don't want starch in the hindgut. You don't want high fat in the hindgut either. It really disrupts that microbial environment and population. And I don't know. I'm sitting here, I'm knocking my hand on my head because I don't know how quite we got away with it, to be honest.
You're lucky.
He didn't even get diarrhea or loose manure. I mean, and my daughter said his girth was really tough. She actually got him out that's how we figured it all out. But she came out, she's like, his girth won't do it. He was bloated. I mean, I think we had a lot of gas.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were lucky that that's really all we had to deal with.
So I store my feed in bins that are designed for feed storage, and they have locking mechanisms. So I put the open bag in, and I can put multiple bags in one large bin with a clip. Not everyone stores their feed like that. Lots of times it goes into like a trash can or something, which if it's not locked away, if the horse can get to it, the horse can knock it over and get the lid off. So that needs to be in a separate feed room where my feed is out in the open, which is why I have the locking bins. But when you're dumping the feed into bins like that, are there any considerations that you should keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, you do need to clean your bins out every now and again, right? So that's always a concern of if you actually empty the grain into the bin and you don't keep it in the bag, then the inside of the bin gets pretty scuzzy. Especially if you're feeding a sweet feed or sticky feed, and that can be pretty difficult to clean out in some situations. It sounds like your feed bins might be quite large, and so it wouldn't be super easy to like clean out on a regular basis. But it also sounds like you're keeping your feed in the sacks and putting it in there, which is generally, I mean, I have metal trash cans with bungees to keep the lids on. So I hook it to the handle on the side of the trash can, wrap it through the lid handle once, and then connect it to the other side. So and it's pretty tight. And I keep my grain in the sack inside the trash can. I can put 2 50-pound bags in my trash cans that way. So that's my preference.
Yeah. And why might you recommend people keep their bags for reasons other than mine, which is just because I haven't taken the time to run them to the recycling center.
Right? All those, yeah. A really good reason to keep the bag is because the bag has identifying information on it that tells you what mill that feed was milled at and the date it was milled on. And if there's ever a recall, that's the information you're going to need to be able to either A, just get a refund from your feed store, or B, know whether you might have a problem or not, right? So, I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard of, such and such a feed company is doing a voluntary recall, and it was from X mill in Missouri or something, and it's, feed milled between, May 13th and the 20th. Well, you have that kind of feed in your feed bin, and you don't have, and you live somewhere, around the neighboring states in Missouri, and but you have no idea. Now you're panicking, right? Because you're like, hey, I don't know, is that where my feed comes from? Like, is there a potential issue with my feed? Like, you have no idea. You have no way of knowing. Yeah. So you don't have to keep the feed bag. I mean, I would just say, fold it up and shove it down the side of the feed bin or something if you tip it out. But I mean, in this day and age, most of us have phones with cameras. So at the very least, figure out which part of the, it's typically on what the bottom seam of the bag, right? So on that seam that seals the bag at the bottom, you'll see a bunch of really weird stamped on letters and numbers. And
that make no sense. Yeah.
No, they don't. That may be the information you're looking for. Normally it's a couple of letters which corresponds to the mill, and then it might be a Julian date, which would be the day of the year. So it might be like 257 or something, or it might be the week of the year. I mean, different mills, there's no standardized way of doing it. Different mills have different coding practices, but you don't have to know what it means. You just have to know it and have a photograph of it or keep the bag. Because when they release the recall, they're going to say bags with this code, and then you'll be able to see if it matches your code.
Yeah. So there is so much more we could talk about when it comes to bag feed. But we've definitely decided to try to keep it simple for this intro basics series that we're doing. But before we go, do you have any parting thoughts or take home messages for horse owners about bagged feeds and choosing what's right for their horse?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, if you can maintain your horse on hay or pasture grass alone, then what you're needing in your bagged feed is what is not provided in your forage, and that's going to be a ration balancer. If your horse cannot maintain its condition on forage alone, then you need something with a little bit more energy density. That's when you start looking at your performance feed, your senior feeds, those kinds of things. And then it's a matter of, looking at the feeding directions and making sure that the amount of feed you want to feed, like if your gut feeling is, I think I need to feed my horse 3 or 4 pounds, is that a feeding direction on the bag that corresponds, to the feed, what the manufacturer says you can do with this feed? And if it's not, then you probably need to be looking at a different feed, right? So you do need to understand your feeding directions, and you do need to follow them in order for your horse's diet to have the best chance of not having any kind of deficiencies or imbalances.
Yeah. And I don't know if we've been super clear about it, but if you are feeding something like a senior feed or performance feed, and you think about 3 pounds a day is enough for your horse, and the portion size that's recommended is 6 pounds, then you can and probably should replace that missing amount with some ration balancer to fill in the gap. So
yeah, you can titrate them, right? So oftentimes, and I think there's a lot of horses out there that fall into this, where you need a little more than the 1-2 pounds of ration balancer, but you don't need 6 pounds of senior. Like a lot of horses fall into that. So what do? Well, you feed maybe 3 pounds of senior and 1 pound of balancer, right? So if your horse gets by just fine on hay, then you need to add just a balancer. If your horse needs more calories to maintain weight than the forage can support, and you can get away with 6+ pounds or whatever the serving size is for that performance or senior feed, great, just feed that. But if your horse falls somewhere in the middle, you titrate the two against each other, and you're going to need both those feeds.
Yeah. And then there does come a point that maybe you need someone like Claire to figure it out for you. So.
Yeah, it can get confusing. I appreciate that. And there's just so many choices. There's so many great feed companies out there with good products that it can get a little bit like, well, whether do I pick company A ration balancer or company B ration balancer? And that's where I start getting into, and we can talk about this on a future episode, like looking at the details of ingredient lists, looking at the details of guaranteed analysis levels, and that can then help you make a more refined choice.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be part of our conversations in the future, please send your suggestions for topics and your equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com. That's info@scoop and is spelled out, scale.com. You can find Claire at Clarity Equine Nutrition if you would like her help with your horse's diet as well. For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Michelle Anderson.
And I'm Dr. Clair Thunes.
Thanks for riding along with us.